Forget the helmets with horns. Forget the cartoons of burly brutes yelling Valhalla while swinging axes in blind rage. Forget the simple stories, the ones that call them raiders, savages, myths, or footnotes. Because what if they were something else entirely? What if the Vikings weren't the end of something, but the beginning? What if behind the storm there was a story? A story of exiles and kings, of rivers turned to roads, of laws written not by emperors but by farmers who could sail? What if their legacy wasn't just buried in frost-bitten graves, but alive in the laws you follow, the language you speak, even the way your mind handles silence? This is not just history. This is a reckoning. Across 15 chapters, we'll travel from the icy edges of Norway to the golden domes of Kiev, from blood-stained monasteries to parchment-bound parliaments, from the roar of the longship to the whisper of ink. We'll meet not just warriors, but poets, not just kings, but widows, not just fire, but roots. This isn't a tale of conquest, it's a transformation, and by the end you won't just know the Vikings. You might realize you've been carrying their fire all along. So ask yourself, when did the Viking Age end? 1066? 1100? Or has it never ended at all? So if you truly want to understand how it all began, not the legend, but the life, then go back. Back before the raids, before the kings, before the ink dried. Back to the place where winter taught men to pray with their hands, not their words. Back to the land that did not welcome them, but forged them. Because to know the Vikings, you must first know the ice. You were never meant to thrive here, not in this land. This place, what we now call Scandinavia, was not shaped for comfort. It was carved by glaciers and tempered by fire, where sunlight bled through gray skies like an old memory, and the wind howled not just across the fjords, but through the marrow of your bones. The soil was stubborn, the seasons cruel, and yet life persisted. Not easily, not gently, but fiercely. Here, in the northern silence, where the trees stood like sentinels, and the cold bit like an old god, a people were forged. They were not born of fertile valleys or gentle rivers, but of granite, pine, and frost. And in time, they would come to be known as Vikings. But before they were legends, before they became ghosts in the prayers of monks and scars on the maps of kings, they were simply survivors. The land had no mercy to offer. Summers were brief, more suggestion than season, and winters were not a thing to endure, but to outwit. To be born in this land was to be born into a pact with death. You would not live unless you learned to shape the world as harshly as it shaped you. So they became craftsmen of survival. From iron they drew blades, from oaks they carved ships. The forest gave them tools, the mountains gave them ore, the sea gave them passage and threat. The gods they worshipped were not distant beacons of forgiveness, but intimate forces of fury. Thor, Odin, Freyja. Gods who walked beside you, took your brother in war, your child in winter, and still demanded a prayer. They didn't beg for miracles. They paid for them, in blood, in fire, in silence. These people, your ancestors if you dare claim them, did not see themselves as noble or savage. There were no such words yet. There was only need, and the need gave birth to a code: courage without witness, honor without reward, loyalty beyond reason. They were raised not with lullabies but with storm chants, not with toys but with iron tools, not with gentle hands but with calloused ones. Their stories were not written, not yet. They were passed from mouth to fire to bone, spoken in smoke, remembered in scars. The sagas began not on parchment, but in the rhythm of axes splitting wood, oars hitting sea, hearts beating fast beneath wolfskin cloaks. This wasn't just a culture, it was a crucible, a world where survival was an art, and each child born into it was a flame trying not to go out. And then came the ships, slender, flexible, fast, carved with snarling beasts and kissed with the scent of pine and pitch. They weren't just tools of war, they were lifeboats of ambition, vessels for those who looked past the mountains and imagined that somewhere beyond the horizon there was more than struggle, that there was land, gold, glory, or, at the very least, enough grain to make it through the next winter. That hunger, that restless ache, was the first true inheritance of the Viking Age. Not bloodlust, not cruelty, but the inability to stay still. The same land that forged them now refused to contain them. There is no origin story carved into stone, no singular spark that ignited what would become centuries of conquest, exploration, and legend. But if you were to trace it, not through maps, but through the rhythm of survival, you'd find it here. In the quiet brutality of early Scandinavia, in the tension between isolation and imagination. They did not wake up one day and decide to be raiders. They were already something more dangerous, dreamers with axes. They dreamed of sailing west, where rumors spoke of rich monasteries with golden goblets and silver crosses. They dreamed of going east, where the rivers stretched like veins into unknown empires. They dreamed of gods not just to worship, but to challenge. And the land watched them go. It had raised them as wild things, shaped by ice and sharpened by iron. And now it loosed them upon the world. But let us not romanticize this too much. These were not heroes in the modern sense. They killed. They burned. They enslaved. And yet, they also traded, negotiated, married, learned new tongues, and wrote poems that still hum across fjords when the wind's just right. They were contradictions walking in human form. They were the children of a world that didn't give them room to be simple. They were born of a place that demanded depth, of strength, of soul, of silence. And from that silence, history would one day shout. So when you think of the Vikings, don't begin with helmets, they didn't have horns. Don't begin with blood, though there was plenty. Don't even begin with ships. Begin here, in the frost, in the forest, in the dark. Begin with the sound of an axe being sharpened by a boy no older than 12. Begin with the way his mother's hands are cracked from grinding wheat, from boiling pine pitch, from burying her third child before spring thaw. Begin with the wind that makes every roof groan and every soul pray. Begin with the understanding that life here was never given, only taken back from the edge of the abyss. And maybe then you'll understand. The Viking Age wasn't a sudden violence that erupted onto the shores of Christian Europe. It was a long, slow storm, whispered into being by snow, hunger, steel, and silence. It was born of ice and iron, and everything that refuses to die quietly. And so it began, not with prophecy, but with pattern. A rhythm of waves, wood, and war. Because before history takes notice, life always sends a warning. And in 793, on a holy island where prayers rose like incense, the warning came ashore in silence. The storm breaks, 793 to 850. There were whispers before there was war. Not all storms begin with thunder. Some arrive softly, like fog creeping over moors, or dread creeping into a bishop's final sermon. In the early summer of 793, the monks of Lindisfarne heard neither drums nor cries. What they heard was the tide, and then the sound of oars, dozens of them, in perfect rhythm, too many to be a fishing boat, too early to be a trade ship, too silent to be pilgrims. Then they saw the hulls, long, low, sleek, cut from pine and sewn with the patience of men who built for rivers and gods, not kings and rules. The bows curled into snarling beasts, dragons, wolves, serpents, faces meant to frighten spirits, But they did far more than that. They terrified men. And just like that, the age of the Viking had begun. Not with a declaration, but with blood on altar stones. Lindisfarne, 793. It should have been an ordinary day of worship. The Holy Island, off the coast of Northumbria, was a sanctuary. For decades it had been a place of learning, prayer, and peace. Pilgrims crossed cold waters to kneel in its churches. Illuminated manuscripts glowed like portals to God himself. Monks copied scripture with aching hands. Candles flickered in the scent of sea salt and parchment. But when the Norse came, they did not bow. They burned. No one could understand the words they shouted. But the language of violence needs no translation. They took the gold chalices, the relics of saints, the silver crosses. They cut down those who clutched their rosaries. The sea that had once brought salvation now brought slaughter. The survivors would later say it was the end of days. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of something far older, far colder, and far more enduring. What followed was not an isolated horror. It was a shift, the kind of shift that changes maps, religions, and the fates of kings. The Vikings came again, and again, not just to Lindisfarne, but to Jarrow, Iona, Portland, and the Isle of Man. By 795, they struck Ireland. By 799, they reached the Frankish coasts. Like lightning jumping from cloud to earth, they moved across seas with eerie precision. But these weren't berserkers yet. Not in the romanticized sense. They were calculating. Fast. Silent. Strategic. They struck where defenses were weakest. Monasteries, coastal villages, ports unguarded by walls. Their longships could sail up rivers that Roman galleys never dared. They weren't bound by seasons, languages, or borders. The old world had rules. The Norse didn't follow them. And that terrified Europe more than the Axes did. But why? Why now? The answer, as always, lies in hunger, and not just of the belly. In Scandinavia, winters were tightening like a belt around the neck of the North. The population was growing, land was scarce. Inheritance customs left younger sons with nothing. A generation of bold, restless men found themselves staring at the horizon, where the sun dipped low, like a promise half-kept. The longship gave them wings, and ambition gave them fire. They sailed not just to raid, but to test the limits of fate, to find silver, to win honor, to become more than the sons of farmers. And Europe, complacent and cloaked in its rituals, was unprepared. The monks who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle could only describe it as divine punishment. Fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians. A great famine, and the harrowing inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. But omens weren't what tore the sanctuary apart. It was men, flesh and blood, driven by something deeper than heresy. They didn't hate the Christian God. They simply had no fear of him. Their gods were closer, bloodier, more personal. And those gods, it seemed, favored them. By the 830s, Viking fleets were no longer small raiding parties. They were floating armies, 60, 80, even 100 ships, coordinated with terrifying discipline. They moved like storms across the British Isles and Francia, striking cities like Dublin, London, Rouen, and even Paris. And the tactics evolved. Some groups began to overwinter in enemy territory, building temporary camps, fortresses made of earth and timber. They were no longer just taking wealth, they were taking space. They studied local politics, exploited tribal rivalries, accepted bribes from one king to attack another. These were not mindless raiders. They were warlords in the making, and the kingdoms of Christendom began to bend. Ireland, 841. The Norse founded a permanent base in Dublin. Not a raid, a settlement. This was something new, and it would spread. Dublin became a hub of trade and slaving. Ships came in from all directions, furs from the north, wine from Francia, silks from the east, and people, taken, sold, exchanged like cattle. Slavery was not invented by the Norse, but they mastered its mechanics in a fractured, brutal world. By mid-century, Viking kingdoms were appearing like cracks in the old order, on the Isle of Man, in Waterford, in York. The storm was no longer just breaking. It was settling in. Still, the Vikings were not without losses. At the Battle of Edington, at the Isle of Thanet, in skirmishes across Wessex and Mercia, their forces were repelled. The Anglo-Saxons learned fast. So did the Franks. King Charlemagne, rattled by attacks on his coastal towns, formed the Marches, buffer zones protected by fortified garrisons. The Carolingian Empire began building riverside defenses, stone watchtowers, and a navy of their own. But for every gate they closed, another river opened. The Vikings were not trying to destroy Europe. They were integrating into it, on their own terms. And what of those left behind in the north? Back in Scandinavia, the spoils of raid returned like strange gifts from another world. Gold relics, silk garments, Frankish swords, Christian icons. The Norse didn't always melt them down. They studied them, adapted them. Their craftsmanship evolved. So did their sense of what power could look like. Young men dreamed not just of being warriors, but of being jarls, chieftains, kings, founders of dynasties. Raids became rituals of passage. Wealth became a currency of loyalty. Alliances were forged over mead and silver, and the North began to take the first steps toward statehood, even as it was tearing into others. And with every raid, with every ship that vanished into mist, a question lingered. Where would they strike next? By 850, the question wasn't if the Vikings would come. It was when, and how many ships would follow behind the first. Europe no longer saw them as a barbarian nuisance. They were a force of nature, erratic, ruthless, but undeniably brilliant. They fought like ghosts. They disappeared like whispers, and they returned like tides. But perhaps the most haunting part of this era was not the violence. It was what the Norsemen revealed about Europe itself. The monasteries, rich, unguarded, sacred, had become soft targets. The kings, divided, arrogant, often paid more than they fought. The people, frightened and faithful, prayed for peace but paid in coin. The Vikings did not bring the apocalypse. They exposed the cracks already running through the old world. They didn't just pillage, they tested, they probed, and they found weakness in places that had long believed themselves invincible. In the sagas that would one day be written, these early decades were remembered in fire and salt. But memory is not always the same as meaning. The storm that broke upon Lindisfarne was not just about axes and treasure. It was about the collision of worldviews, one that believed in salvation after death, the other that believed in glory before it. And for a time, the latter had the wind behind it. Next came the settlements. Not just camps, but towns. Not just raids, but rule. And with that came a new chapter. Because storms don't last forever. Eventually, they take root. And when the Vikings did, they wouldn't just burn kingdoms. They'd build them. Because even storms, for all their violence, carry seeds. And once the thunder faded, something unexpected began to grow. The same hands that once gripped axes began to shape plows. And the question shifted, not from how to conquer, but how to endure. The settlers, 850 to 900. At first, the earth didn't know what to do with them. The land they once burned now had to be tilled. The rivers they once raced through now had to be crossed with grain, not blades. The forests they once hid in now had to be cleared for longhouses and livestock. It's one thing to raid a monastery. It's another to raise a child. By the middle of the 9th century, the Norse had changed the question. They no longer asked, "Where can we strike?" Now they wondered, "Where can we stay?" The storm, having broken the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia, began to settle into the cracks it had made. Not every Viking returned home. Some stopped running. Some unpacked their gods and started planting wheat. England, 866. The year the Danes stopped knocking and simply walked in. A great heathen army landed on English shores, not a band of raiders, an organized force. Thousands of men, veteran warlords, winter-hardened soldiers. They came with horses, banners, and intent, not to raid, but to take. And they took York. York, the Roman city, the jewel of Northumbria, a place of history, governance, stone walls, and Christian pride. It fell to the Danes with startling efficiency. But what shocked the English more than the conquest was what came next. The Danes didn't burn York to the ground. They rebuilt it. They reopened markets, reinforced walls, renamed streets, raised children. They laid foundations, not just fires. This wasn't surrender. This was something far more permanent. This was Danelaw, a Norse-controlled swath of northeastern England, encompassing York, Lincoln, Derby, and Leicester. It was carved out not just by blades, but by settlements, law, and land division. And it wasn't chaos. The Danes brought with them their own sense of justice. Thing assemblies, land courts, oaths sworn on hammers instead of Bibles. Their laws weren't written, but remembered. Their judgments weren't arbitrary, but respected. They weren't just invaders, they were neighbors now. And that terrified people in a completely different way. But why settle? Why, after nearly a century of plunder and fear, would hardened warriors choose farming? The answer was layered. For one, they had won. Victory creates its own gravity. There was no need to flee when the land lay broken and unguarded, but more than that, they were tired. War gives glory, but it takes sons, weakens arms, drains the heart. A generation of Viking men began to see more honor in building than burning. They wanted to be remembered not just for the blood they spilled, but for the land they passed on. The axe still hung by the door. But now, next to it, hung a plowshare. And not all settlers came by force. Some came by marriage, trade, or necessity. The Saxons who stayed often intermarried. The lines between Norse and English blurred quickly, names fused. Gods coexisted uneasily. Children learned 2 languages before they learned to hunt. A new people was forming. Not quite Viking, not quite Saxon. They spoke with strange accents, wore blended tunics, named their children things like Eirikr Athelstan and Guthrum Edmundsson. They were not born of conquest. They were born of contact. And in that space between sword and soil, culture happened. Ireland, 841. Dublin, once a simple Norse base, was now a city. Not just a camp, not a seasonal raid post. A city with walls, streets, workshops, and graveyards. Norse artisans shaped brooches and swords in smoky forges. Slaves hauled goods across muddy roads. Women, Norse and Irish alike, carried water, brewed ale, and bore children who would grow up not knowing which god to fear more. From Dublin, trade stretched in all directions. Furs and amber from the Baltic, Frankish wine and Islamic silver, slaves from everywhere. By 850, Dublin had its own king. Norse kingship wasn't sacred, it was pragmatic. A king led in war, judged disputes, and died when he failed. His authority came not from God, but from gold, courage, and loyal men with sharp steel. In time, these Norse-Irish settlements spread. Waterford, Limerick, Cork. They formed a chain, not of conquest, but of connection. And with every generation, the line between Viking and Irishman blurred. They began to bury their dead together. They shared cattle. They sang each other's songs. Sometimes, conquest dies not with defeat, but with familiarity. Meanwhile, in Francia, another transformation was taking shape. After decades of Viking terror along the Seine and Loire, King Charles the Simple made a simple decision. If you can't stop them, hire them. In 911, he granted a Viking warlord named Rollo a slice of land along the northern coast in exchange for peace, protection, and a Christian baptism. That land became Normandy, land of the Northmen. What began as a bribe became a dynasty. The Normans didn't just settle, they absorbed. They learned Latin, adopted Christian names, built cathedrals, and married into Frankish nobility. And then they turned those tools outward, using French diplomacy and Viking boldness to become one of the most formidable forces in medieval Europe. But that came later. For now, they were just settlers with ambitions. So what did it mean to be Norse in this new age? Was it still blood and sea, or something else? You might walk the streets of York in 875 and see a man with a braided beard hammering nails into a ship, and then walking to a Christian church to hear Mass. You might see a woman with runes tattooed down her arm buying fabric dyed with foreign colors. You might see children carving both Thor's hammer and the cross into a single piece of wood. It wasn't confusion, it was transition. Cultures don't change in a moment. They bleed into each other, slowly, sometimes violently, often intimately. And the Viking Age was no exception. By 900, the storm had reshaped the very soil it once shattered. Kingdoms had not fallen, but bent. Faith had not vanished, but changed shape. The people who had once come screaming from the sea now stood behind market stalls, handed their sons farming tools, argued over fence lines, paid taxes, gave dowries, and wrote their sagas with ink instead of fire. But make no mistake, they had not gone soft. They had grown patient, because every settlement was a seed. And seeds do not forget the storm that planted them, because while the western shore taught the Norse how to bend the world, the eastern rivers offered something deeper, not conquest, but transformation. And so, as farms took root in the Danelaw and Norse tongues, softened into local dialects, others slipped quietly into the veins of the East, drawn not by glory, but by gravity. The eastward current, 860–1000. They say the Northmen always looked west, toward golden monasteries, wide oceans, and trembling kings, but that was only half true. Because some of them, those who listened more to the river than the wind, turned east. And what they found was not just land. They found a mirror. Not of themselves exactly, but of what they might become. It began, as so many things did in the Viking world, with a journey into silence. Not the silence of winter or prayer, but of rivers too wide for memory and too long for maps. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Neva. These weren't just waterways, they were arteries, and the Norsemen followed them like blood seeking a heart. 860. They weren't conquerors yet, just merchants, wanderers, Varangians, the Slavic tribes called them, sworn men. Tall, fair-haired, foreign-tongued. They came with furs, swords, and amber. They left with silver, silk, and stories. What the Norse discovered was a fractured land. Slavic villages, steppe nomads, forgotten cities, and caravan trails stretching like veins from the Black Sea to the Caspian, from the Baltic to Baghdad. There were no kings here, just spaces waiting to be filled. And the Norse had never been afraid of empty spaces. Legend says that in 862, the Slavic and Finnic tribes invited a Norse chieftain named Rurik to rule them. Not because they were weak, but because they were tired of quarreling. "Come and rule over us," they said, "for there is no justice among ourselves." Rurik came, not with fire, but with structure. He settled in Novgorod, the new city, a fortress in the north, beside the Volkhov River. From there his kin began to trace their way southward. one oar stroke at a time. By 882, Rurik's successor, Oleg the Wise, had captured Kiev. He sailed down the Dnieper, subdued the local rulers, and declared Kiev the new capital. He called his new realm Rus. No one knew what it meant. Maybe it came from rods, rowers. Maybe from ruotsi, the Finnish word for Sweden. But names, like rivers, grow wider with time. This was no mere Viking colony. It was something entirely new. Not Norse, not Slavic, not Byzantine, but all of them at once. A composite civilization born in muddy fords and marketplaces, shaped as much by translation as by steel. The rulers spoke Old Norse. The subjects spoke Old East Slavic. The scribes would later write in Greek and Cyrillic. And somewhere between them, a nation was being whispered into existence. The rivers became roads. The Varangians, now princes and traders, paddled down to the Black Sea, reached Constantinople, and gazed upon the marble bones of empire. The Byzantines called them Rus, and alternately feared, hired, and traded with them. They brought slaves, wax, honey, and furs. They returned with wine, silk, and visions of a world gilded in mosaics and incense. But more than anything, they came for silver. It flowed from the east like water, minted in the Islamic caliphates, stamped with Arabic prayers, and traded by weight across every outpost of the Viking world. Baghdad and Byzantium, Kiev and Burka, Novgorod and Samarkand. The Norse didn't just raid anymore, they networked. To sail these rivers was to gamble with your soul. The Dnieper had 7 major portages, places where ships had to be carried overland, sometimes for days, while raiders lurked in the woods. Sandbars tore hulls. Fever struck from stagnant pools. Wolves, totters, heat, snow, isolation. And yet they came, again and again, because every journey east was also a journey inward, into a land of ghosts, into an identity not yet formed, into a future no saga had written. By the late 10th century, the Rus had become more than just traders with foreign gods. They were political players, kings in all but name. They signed treaties with Byzantium. They fielded armies of Slavs, Norsemen, and Turkic mercenaries. They built wooden fortresses, minted coins, collected tribute. But the most profound transformation came not through steel or silver. It came through faith. 988. Prince Vladimir the Great, a descendant of Rurik, converted to Christianity. Not the Latin kind of Wessex or Francia, but Eastern Orthodoxy, rich with incense and ritual. He was baptized in Chersonesus, in the Crimea. He returned to Kiev and ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River. It wasn't sudden, but it was seismic. The Norse gods had been fading in the east for a while, overshadowed by icons, relics, and the allure of imperial legitimacy. And Vladimir wanted something the old gods couldn't give him. Unity, recognition, a throne inside history, not outside it. So Odin was traded for Christ, runes for crosses, longhouses for basilicas. But the rivers remained. And along their banks, Viking blood and Slavic soil mingled until they could no longer be separated. What emerged in the east was not a Viking colony. It was a kingdom of echoes, a place where Norse sagas were retold in Slavic mouths, where Byzantine priests read from Greek scrolls in halls built by axe-calloused hands, where a people who once rode for silver now ruled for centuries. The Rurikid dynasty, descended from those river-born wanderers, would shape the fate of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Long after the last longship had rotted, long after the sagas stopped being sung. But the Norse never disappeared. They became something else. Their names changed. Their gods died. But their habits endured. Love of cold steel, respect for cunning, suspicion of central authority, reverence for ancestors, and a quiet, almost sacred, respect for the river. If you walk the banks of the Volkhov today, if you stand in the ruins of Novgorod or stare at the stones in Kiev, if you listen hard enough, you might still hear it. The creak of wood, the dip of an oar, the low hum of men rowing toward a future they didn't yet understand. Not as Vikings, not as Slavs, but as Rus, born of currents, bound by trade, and remembered only in fragments, like the glittering trail of a silver coin slipping into water. And while the rivers of the east carried the Norse toward empire, the western winds whispered something different. Not command, but calling. Not empire, but escape. Because for some, destiny wasn't found in founding dynasties or ruling cities. It was in fleeing them. And so, while the Rus rooted themselves in the soil of Slavic lands, others turned their eyes westward, toward fog, myth, and freedom. The western horizon, 860 to 1000. Some people raid because they're hungry, some because they're ambitious, but some because they just don't belong. Not in courts, not in tribes, not even in their own homeland. What lies to the east is often strategy. What lies to the west is longing. And that was the hunger that drove the Norse toward the unknown edges of the sea. It began with a whisper, passed between oarsmen, traders, and outlaws. A story, not yet a map. Somewhere past the mist and ice, beyond the broken cliffs and endless water, there were islands. And not just rocks for birds or seals, islands with grass, with trees, with space enough to breathe without someone else's god, feud, or law over your shoulder. 860 Norsemen first sighted Iceland. Maybe by accident, maybe in exile. That's how it often started. A man exiled for a blood feud, a ship blown off course, a crew too stubborn to die. But what they found was a world made of contradiction. Mountains clawing the sky, glaciers like sleeping gods, lava fields black as sin, valleys so green they felt like forgiveness, and silence. Not the silence of sleep, the silence of something sacred. By 870, they began to arrive not as scouts, but as settlers, fleeing political chaos in Norway, civil war, and the iron grip of King Harald Fairhair. Families packed entire lives into ships, cattle, seed grain, timber, even gods. Thor's hammer carved into the beams of the hull, and they crossed the North Atlantic not with conquest in mind, but continuity. They wanted to build something their own, a place untouched by kings and kingdoms, where law came from community, where stories came from stone. There were no native peoples to displace in Iceland, only the land to reckon with. Volcanoes that split the sky, earthquakes that groaned like old gods waking, ash that choked fields, and winters so long even the stars felt brittle. But the Norse were stubborn. They built turf houses, half underground, half prayer. They grew barley where nothing should grow. They fished like breathing depended on it, because it did. And they kept records, not in marble, but in memory. Iceland became not just a refuge, it became a mirror. In the isolation, they wrote themselves down, oral sagas etched in minds, passed from fire to fire, father to son, the Íslendingabók, the Landnámabók, the sagas of the Icelanders. Not propaganda, not legend, but something truer. Stories of flawed men, stubborn women, ghosts, curses, justice, revenge, and love that outlives war. Where other nations built castles, Iceland built narrative. And for the first time in Viking history, the pen began to matter as much as the axe. In 930, the settlers gathered at Thingvellir to form the Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament. No king, no palace, just a rift valley where law met voice. Once a year, chieftains came to settle disputes, recite judgments, arrange marriages, and swear oaths. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And in that fragile space between lava and sky, a new Norse identity took root, not as conquerors, but as custodians of memory. But Iceland was not the edge. Not yet. Because someone, always someone, looked out across the sea and said, "What else?" That someone was Eric the Red, a man made more of exile than empire, banished from Norway for murder, then banished from Iceland, also for murder. Where others saw a pattern, Eric saw possibility. He followed whispers of a land to the west, a place seen by a man named Gunnbjorn, just sighted, never landed. Eric went further. In the 980s he found it, a vast frozen island with fjords, meadows, and miles of unforgiving ice. He named it Greenland, a lie, perhaps, but a useful one. Because Eric understood something. To build a new world, you sometimes had to sell it first. By 986, a fleet of 25 ships left Iceland for Greenland. Only 14 made it. Storms swallowed the rest. But those who survived built two main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, on Greenland's southern fringe. No kings, no fortresses, just farms clinging to coastal cracks, wool, dairy, dried fish, and silence, always silence. Life there was hard, unforgiving. The soil was thin. The climate turned colder. But for a time it worked. Churches rose, bishops came, sagas were told, and the edge of the world was redrawn again. But not even Greenland was far enough, because Eric had a son, Leif. Leif Erikson was different. Less blood on his hands, more light in his eyes. He heard stories from a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had seen land even further west, beyond Greenland, wooded, flat, strange. And in the year C-1000, Leif sailed out to find it. What he discovered, if discovery is even the right word, was a land unlike any other. He called it Vinland, not for vineyards, but for wild grapes, for fertile soil, for rivers that ran clean and deep. It was likely Newfoundland, or perhaps somewhere along the coast of Nova Scotia. He stayed a winter, built houses, explored, and then he left. Others came after, like Thorvald Eriksson, who was killed by the native peoples, the Skrælings. There were skirmishes, fear, misunderstanding. The Norse didn't stay, not because the land wasn't good, but because it wasn't empty, and the Norse, for all their boldness, had grown tired of endless struggle. Vinland faded into myth. No permanent colonies, no lasting conquest. But it was real. Fragments of Norse artifacts have been found at Lance aux Meadows, a windswept patch of Newfoundland where sod walls once stood against the ocean. It was the first known European settlement in the Americas, 500 years before Columbus. And yet, it didn't become an empire. It became a whisper. A story told by firelight, half believed. Of a land across the water where the rivers run sweet, the winters bite, and the horizon always waits. So, what was the Western expansion really? Not a victory, not a failure, a pilgrimage, by exiles, by visionaries, by ghosts. A movement west not for wealth, but for belonging. They weren't fleeing enemies. They were fleeing the limits of the known, trying to outrun fate, trying to plant roots in the void, trying to write their names in snow, wind, and salt air. By the year 1000, the Viking world had stretched from Constantinople to Canada. And yet, even then, the people who once rode from fjord to forest were beginning to slow. The world was changing, Kings were rising, churches were growing stronger, and the Viking soul, restless, wandering, wild, was being asked to settle, but not yet. There was still time, still stories to carve into stone, still places to go, even if only in dreams. And even as their sails faded into legend and their axes dulled with time, the westward dream did not vanish. It evolved. What began as myth around a fire became maps on parchment. What began as exile became inheritance. And in the misty estuaries of northern Francia, that restless Norse spirit found not conquest, but compromise. Not plunder, but permanence. Normandy. A kingdom forged. The sea had once been their cathedral, the longship, their altar, the axe, their scripture. But by the early 900s, something had changed. The Norse were no longer just ghosts from the mist. They were neighbors, traders, landlords, and increasingly rulers. And nowhere did this strange metamorphosis burn more brightly or more dangerously than in the cradle of Francia's northern coast. This was not a raid. This was a deal, a gamble, a kingdom forged not by blood alone, but by oath. 911. The year the wild men were baptized, not by faith, by necessity. Charles the Simple, king of West Francia, was running out of options. The rivers had become highways for Norse raiders. Rouen, Bayeux, Paris itself, all had bled under their sails. Charles had tried force. He had built forts, summoned armies, paid bribes, and still they came. But one Viking leader was different, not just a raider, a strategist, a man named Rollo. No one quite agrees where Rollo came from. Some say Denmark, others say Norway. What they all agree on is what he wanted: land, legitimacy, and the freedom to rule in a language not his own. So Charles did something desperate. He offered it: a tract of land along the lower Seine, a Christian baptism, a noble title, and the king's own daughter in marriage. In return, Rollo would do what armies could not: protect Francia from his own kind. It was a moment soaked in irony. A Viking warlord made a duke, a man baptized at sword point, a pagan made prince over priests. They say Rollo hesitated when asked to kiss the king's foot in homage, and when he did, he lifted Charles's leg so high the king fell backward. Respect, yes. Humiliation? No. And so Normandy was born, not in conquest, in compromise. But this was not submission. It was conversion, political, cultural, even spiritual. A shift from chaos to order, from raid to reign. Rollo ruled with fire in his eyes but structure in his hands. He kept the Norse loyal and the Franks terrified. And he began to build something that could last. Normandy was not Scandinavia. It was older, softer, more layered. Latin, not runes. Stone, not timber. Wine, not mead. But Rollo and his descendants were not swallowed by this world. They devoured it piece by piece. They adopted the French language, built churches with strange Viking flourishes, married into noble houses, and trained their sons not in sagas, but in strategy. Because survival in this new land required adaptation without erasure, the Norse in Normandy became something else, something sharper. Not quite Viking, not quite French, but Norman. A new beast, part wolf, part fox, clad in armor, wielding law like a dagger, with ambition stitched into every seam. And Normandy prospered. Its location was perfect, an economic hinge between England, Francia, and the North Sea. Its harbors welcomed traders and mercenaries. Its dukes collected taxes like kings, built castles like warlords, and trained cavalry like emperors. But beneath the surface, the Viking flame still smoldered. They remembered the old gods, even as they prayed to new ones. They remembered the longships, even as they rode war horses. They remembered what it meant to be uninvited, to take what others thought untouchable, and that memory was a weapon. By the time of Richard I, Rollo's grandson Normandy was no longer a fragile treaty state. It was a power. Richard played kings against one another. He defended Normandy from Frankish invasion. He encouraged monastic reform, more out of control than piety, and he raised his children to think bigger than rivers and borders. He understood something primal. The Normans were not meant to be contained. They had been forged in uncertainty, in exile, in fire. And now they were honed, razor-sharp, heavily armed, diplomatically fluent. By 1000, Normandy was a kingdom in everything but name. It minted its own coins, negotiated its own treaties, commanded its own armies, and whispered, always whispered, about the land across the sea. England. A fractured realm. A rich land with weak kings and old grudges. A place whose language still sang like the North. And across the Channel, the Normans were watching, waiting. This was the final genius of the Norman project. They remembered where they came from, but they no longer needed to return. They had taken the fire of the Viking Age and sealed it in armor. They wore it not on their sleeves, but under their skin. And in that silence, they became unstoppable. So what was Normandy? It was not a Viking colony. It was a crucible. Where Norse ferocity met Frankish discipline. Where swords became symbols. Where identity was melted down and recast into something harder. Something with a crown in its future. They came from the sea, these Normans. But now they moved through courts, not currents. They used inheritance, not invasion. Charters, not chaos. But if you looked into their eyes, you could still see the storm. And while the Normans perfected the art of domination in stone castles and velvet silence, another branch of the Norse family tree grew eastward. Quieter, colder, deeper. Not with pageantry, but with patience. Not with fleets, but with rivers. As the western heirs turned swords into scepters, the eastern kin turned currents into kingdoms. The rise of the Rus. By the time the Normans were forging dukedoms from treaties and dynasties from raids, something quieter, yet no less profound, was stirring in the east. No coastline to storm, no cathedrals to burn, only rivers, forest, snow, and silence. But out of that silence, a new kind of power was beginning to speak. Not in screams, but in structure. Not in plunder, but in policy. Not in sagas, but in history. This was the land of the Rus, and they were no longer rowing toward someone else's empire. They were becoming their own. The story didn't start with kings. It started with merchants, with oars, with fur, with the cool shimmer of silver dirhams stamped with Arabic script. In the 800s, the Norse had moved east not to conquer, but to connect, to turn rivers into roads and strange lands into trading posts. They founded Novgorod and later Kiev, not as colonies, but as hubs. But what they found along the Dnieper and the Volga wasn't just profit, it was potential. It was scattered Slavic tribes, forgotten fortresses, nomadic steppe lords, a world begging to be bound together, not by faith or fear, but by order. And no one understood order like a people raised by winter. By the early 900s, the Rus had settled into something more than migration. They were ruling, but not as Vikings anymore. The axes were still there, sheathed at their sides, but the true power came from other weapons now. Diplomacy, tribute, fear, and faith. The Norse blood in them still pulsed, but it was colder now, slower, tactical. They no longer screamed onto beaches, they negotiated down rivers. It was under the rule of Prince Igor, son of Rurik, that the Rus began to assert their authority like a state. He expanded tribute systems, controlled trade routes, fought back the Pechenegs and Byzantine trickery. But Igor died badly, captured and executed by the Drevlians in 945, torn apart by trees, literally. 2 bent trunks were tied to his legs and then released. His body split like fate itself. But his death didn't bring collapse. It brought revenge. And something rarer still in Viking history. A queen who ruled alone. Olga of Kiev, wife of Igor, mother to his heir, and perhaps the most ruthless political mind of the Viking diaspora. She avenged Igor not with brute force, but with psychological horror. She burned cities, buried diplomats alive, poisoned wells, and broke the backs of the Drevlians until they vanished from history. But that was just her prologue, because Olga did something even more shocking than vengeance. She converted to Christianity. In the 950s, she visited Constantinople. There she met the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. He was intrigued. She was unmoved. He proposed marriage. She declined. "I have already been baptized," she said, "and you are my godfather." It was the sharpest rejection in diplomatic memory, and yet she returned to Kiev with something new in her soul, a cross and a question. Could the Rus rule not just by fear, but by divine right? Her grandson would try to answer it. His name was Vladimir. History would call him the Great. But he didn't start that way. He came to power through war and betrayal, murdering his brothers, seizing Kiev, and claiming the throne not by succession but by survival. He was pagan, brutal, a lover of women and war. And yet in his rule, something shifted, like the rivers freezing in early winter. By 988, Vladimir saw what raw power could not give him. Not unity, not legacy, not immortality. He needed a faith that could organize a people, a symbol that could turn allegiance into loyalty, a structure that could outlive him. He looked around: Islam, Judaism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy. Each one was studied, judged, weighed not for purity, but for utility. And Vladimir, ever the calculating prince, chose the one that gave him the greatest leverage: Byzantine Christianity. The richest, the most ornate, the most imperial. He was baptized in Chersonesus in Crimea, and when he returned to Kiev, he ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River, not with swords, but with sermons. The idols of the old gods were cast into the water: Thor, Perun, Veles. The river accepted them, but it didn't forget. The Rus had changed. Not in name, but in nature. They now had churches, stone cathedrals, clergy, bishops, icons. They had written laws, influenced by Byzantium and the Church. They had embassies in Constantinople, marriages with European nobility. The grandsons of raiders were now princes in embroidered robes, discussing theology, issuing decrees, and sitting on carved thrones in candlelit halls. But even as gold replaced silver, the foundation was still Norse. Their cities were laid out like Norse fortresses. Their military structure, still rooted in Varangian discipline. Their elite guards, still loyal to axe and honor. By the late 900s, the Rurikid dynasty stretched from Novgorod to Kiev to the Black Sea. They were no longer clients. They were sovereigns. The Rus' princes ruled not by raid, but by inheritance, by tax, by landholding, by bloodline. But it was a fragile web. The realm was divided among sons and cousins. Alliances shifted with the seasons. Betrayal was common. The flame was strong, but scattered. Still it burned. In 988, the same year as Vladimir's baptism, the Rus achieved something no other Norse descendant could match. They fused Viking freedom with imperial structure. They had what the Norwegians lacked, what the Danes had barely begun, what the Normans were still reaching for. They had statehood, and they had built it from rivers, revenge, trade, and transformation. But perhaps the most haunting part of the Rus' rise is this. They did it by becoming unrecognizable to their ancestors. The gods were gone, the longships grounded, the runes forgotten, and yet the soul remained, in the obsidian eyes of a prince giving alms, in the sharp silence before a campaign, in the way they still trusted oaths more than titles. Because beneath the gold and incense, the Rus were still born of frost, born of exile, born of the long, dark river. And when history speaks of them, of Rurik, of Olga, of Vladimir, it speaks not in glory, but in awe. For they did not just survive the Viking Age, they outlasted it. They absorbed it. They outgrew it. And in doing so, became something terrifying, a legacy. And yet, while the East built thrones from frost, the West whispered something else. Not power, but perseverance. Not empire, but endurance. For beyond the reach of kings, past the rim of the known world, another Norse story was being written, not in gold, but in silence. Greenland and the edge of the world. By the year 1000, the Norse world had carved itself into history. From Kiev's golden domes to Normandy's stone halls, from Iceland's windswept parliaments to Vinland's wild shores, the Viking spirit had become many things: warrior, lawmaker, king. But west of it all, beyond memory, beyond maps, was a place that resisted both conquest and collapse. A place not forged by glory, but by endurance. This was Greenland, the edge of the world. And the story that unfolded there wasn't one of triumph. It was the last breath of an age. It began, like much of Norse history, in exile. In the 980s, a man named Eric the Red was banished from Iceland for murder. Not his first, not his last. But Eric didn't vanish. He sailed west. He had heard rumors, fragments of sighting by Gunnbjorn Ulfsson years earlier, of a distant land across the sea, where the sun shone strangely and mountains walked in fog. Eric went to find it. And when he returned, he had a name. Greenland, he called it. Because even exile needs marketing. If the land has a good name, Eric said, more men will go there. And so they did. In 986, Eric led 25 ships from Iceland toward this frozen promise. Only 14 arrived. Storms, icebergs, wrecks. The sea demanded its tax. But for those who survived, Greenland offered something rare: space, room to farm, to raise cattle, to live without kings, neighbors, or noise. Two main settlements were formed: the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq, and the western settlement farther up the coast. Together they became the westernmost outposts of the Viking world. Turf houses, cattle pens, Norse churches, all built on ground that had never known them. It wasn't paradise. The soil was thin, the summers brief, the winters eternal. But the settlers endured. They fished, hunted seals, raised sheep and goats. They harvested driftwood from the sea like treasure. They traded with Iceland and Norway, sending walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, and polar bear skins. And somehow, they survived. Not through conquest, through cooperation with nature's cruelty. In the east, kingdoms rose and fell. But in Greenland, life barely changed. The people built churches from local stone. They carved runes into rock. They held on to their language, their law, their memories, and in 1126, a bishopric was officially established in Greenland. They had a cathedral. They paid tithes to Rome. They were now part of Christendom, not just geographically distant, but spiritually tethered. Yet even this connection was fragile. A bishop might arrive, or not. Supplies might come, or vanish in storms. Greenland lived by the mercy of ice and salt. To live there was to disappear slowly. There was no king's court, no battlefield glory, no sagas written from these settlements, only echoes. The creak of sod roofs under snow, the breath of cattle in frost-bitten stables, the prayer whispered to both God and the wind. For centuries, Greenland endured, but the signs of decline were always there. The western settlement, the more isolated of the two, began to vanish first. By the 1300s it was quiet, not destroyed, just gone. No mass graves, no enemy invasion, just abandonment, evaporation, a culture dissolving like frost at sunrise. Historians offer theories. Climate change. The onset of the Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons, lengthened winters. Soil erosion. Centuries of grazing may have stripped the already thin earth. Isolation. As trade with Norway slowed, tools rusted, spirits dimmed. Conflict with the Inuit. Competition for scarce resources grew. But maybe it wasn't one thing. Maybe Greenland died like old myths do, not with a sword, but with a whisper. By the 15th century, the eastern settlement, the last stronghold, also went silent. The last known written record is a wedding in 1408 in the church at Valsey. After that, nothing. No news, no letters, no ships, just silence. And when later explorers arrived, all they found were ruins, stone churches with no congregation, turf walls swallowed by moss, a community erased, not by catastrophe, but by time. And so Greenland became legend, a place that existed, then didn't, a ghost colony at the edge of the world. But maybe that's fitting, because Greenland was never meant to expand. It was the last frontier of a culture already in retreat. By the time its farms froze and its altars crumbled, the Norse world had already changed beyond recognition. Kings ruled in Denmark. Cathedrals rose in Sweden. Christianity had polished the axe into a cross. The age of exploration had passed from Vikings to empires, and the sagas were closing. Still, Greenland mattered, because it taught the final lesson of the Norse story, that even the fiercest culture, restless, sea-bound, blood-tied, cannot outrun entropy. You can survive a storm, but not centuries of slow forgetting. You can conquer kingdoms, but not distance from history. And yet, Greenland wasn't failure. It was faith. Faith that life could cling to a frozen shore, that cattle could graze where trees would not grow, that people could build stone sanctuaries beneath northern lights, that even on the edge of the world, meaning could be carved into silence. If you stand in Hvalsey today, you can still see it. The church walls, the window arches, the altar stone, half buried in lichen. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear nothing. Which is to say, you'll hear everything. The end of an era. The breath of a vanished people. The cold memory of those who chose exile over surrender, silence over kingship, the edge of the world over the center of it. That silence in Valsey, the hush beneath the stone and sky, was not just the echo of a place. It was the beginning of an ending. For what faded in Greenland would soon fade across the north. Not all at once, but breath by breath, settlement by surrender. The end of the Viking Age, 1000 to chapter 1100. There is a silence that comes after the storm, not peace, not triumph, just the slow settling of dust, the creak of armor traded for robes, the last ripple before the sea turns still again. This was the end of the Viking Age. Not a moment, not a battle, but a decade by decade surrender. Not to a stronger enemy, but to change itself. By the year 1000, The Norse world stretched wide, from Greenland to Kiev, Iceland to Sicily, from merchant princes to crowned dukes, from Odin's whispered riddles to the rigid bells of Rome. But with every cathedral stone laid in Denmark, with every oath sworn under Christian law, with every crown forged from bloodlines and bureaucracy, the old way of life faded. The long ships still sailed. But now they carried bishops, ambassadors, tax records. And on every sail was stitched a question the Norse had never asked before. What does it mean to stay? Norway, once a land of feuding jarls and frost-bitten kingdoms, was now staring down unification. The work had begun under Harold Fairhair a century earlier, but by 1015 his descendant, Olaf Haraldsson, would seize the mantle. A warrior, a Christian, a king. He had fought in England, seen the might of centralized rule, and when he returned home he didn't bring plunder. He brought purpose. Olaf crushed the local chieftains. He burned pagan temples. He baptized Norway in both water and war. And in 1024, he formalized a national church, binding crown and cross into something unbreakable. But the people weren't ready, and Olaf's rule was harsh. In 1030, at the Battle of Stiklestad, he fell, killed by his own people. Yet death, for Olaf, was a door. Within a year, miracles were reported at his grave, his body uncorrupted, his spirit unyielding. The church canonized him, and the people who had killed their king now worshipped him as a saint. Norway was no longer Viking. It was Christian. It was a kingdom. Meanwhile, in Denmark, the axe had already become a scepter. Sweyn Forkbeard had conquered England in 1013 but died months later. His son, Canute the Great, would finish what he started. Canute ruled over a North Sea empire. Denmark, Norway, and England united under one crown, not by brute force alone, but by marriage, law, diplomacy, administration. He paid the church. He built roads. He issued charters in Latin. He was a Viking by birth, but a Roman in governance. When he died in 1035, his empire fractured. But something had changed forever. The dream of empire was no longer eastward or seaward. It was inward. It was continental, clerical, crowned. England, too, bore the scars of Norse ambition. The Anglo-Saxons had resisted, fought for every hill and chapel, but they couldn't hold. In 1066, the year that shattered the past, Harald Hardrada, last great Viking king, sailed from Norway to claim the English throne. He was a giant of a man, a legend made flesh, a warrior of the old style, tales of Byzantium clinging to his shoulders like frost. He fought at Stamford Bridge, and he died there. Arrow through the throat. The Viking Age died with him. Days later, William of Normandy, himself a descendant of Norse settlers, landed in Sussex. By year's end, England was under Norman rule, but the invaders no longer wore wolf pelts. They wore silk, spoke French, prayed to Rome. The sea kings had become landlords. Across Scandinavia, something deeper had occurred. Paganism was not just outlawed, it had grown unfashionable. Gods of war, thunder, and trickery had no place in tax records and bishoprics. Thor's hammer was worn quietly now, if at all. Odin's ravens no longer circled courts, only mines. Churches stood where groves once whispered, and sagas became inked manuscripts, bound by monks. The Norse world was now being recorded, and in being recorded, it was reframed. The wild, fluid fire of oral tradition was cooled by quill and cross. History replaced memory, law replaced vengeance, hierarchy replaced heroism. Even the most remote outposts, Iceland, Orkney, Shetland, Faroe, began sending tithes to Rome. Their laws echoed the Althing, yes, but their souls bent toward cannon and crown. A Norse child born in 1080 would not know a long ship, would never see a human sacrifice, would never chant under the aurora to a god who demanded blood. He would be taught the Lord's Prayer. He would kneel, and when he heard the word Viking, it would mean the past. The transformation was not betrayal. It was inevitable. You can only raid a village so many times before someone builds a wall. You can only trade so far before someone asks for tax. You can only pray to war gods so long before your people crave peace. What began as resistance, against kings, against Christ, against borders, became surrender not to enemies, but to structure. The Viking world did not fall. It was not destroyed. It was absorbed, refined, translated, tamed. And yet, if you look carefully, its pulse still lingers. In the law codes of Scandinavia, echoes of thing gatherings and spoken verdicts. In the royal lineages of Europe, the blood of raiders turned kings. In the ships of the Hanseatic League, descendants of Norse merchants sailing still. In the languages of England, Normandy, and Russia, Norse words braided into the tongues of a continent. And in every soul who has felt the pull of the unknown, who has dreamed of open water, ungoverned skies, and the clean air beyond law, the Viking lives. So when did the Viking Age end? Some say 1066, with Harald Hardrada's fall. Some say 1100, when the last pagan sanctuaries crumbled. But the truth is, it never ended. It was buried alive in velvet and parchment, in royal seals and cathedral bells, in the names of towns, the shape of maps, the fear of the sea. The axe was sheathed, but never forgotten. The longship docked, but its silhouette still haunts harbors. And the voice that once cried, "To the oars!" now prays in Latin, writes in law, rules by inheritance. But listen closely. In the crackle of fire, in the hush before a storm, in the eyes of a man who looks west with nothing to lose, you can still hear it. The old world, the cold wind, the Viking soul. But the soul was only the beginning. What survived was not just spirit, but structure. The fire became ink, the cry became law, and the age that never truly ended began to shape the world in quieter, deeper ways. The sails are gone, the oars stilled. The ravens have left the mast, the Viking Age has ended, but its memory, its weight, remains. Not only in bones buried beneath frost, not only in broken swords or scattered runes, but in the way the modern world still remembers, builds, and speaks. What the Norse carved with iron and lived in blood, the centuries rewrote in ink. And the legacy that was once shouted across fjords now whispers through law, language, myth, and memory. This is how the Viking world endures, not in kingdoms, but in currents, cultural, linguistic, legal, and spiritual, still flowing, still shaping. The geography of memory, stand in Dublin, York, Kiev, Normandy, Reykjavik, or even the ruins of Greenland, and you are walking in their footprints. What began as raids became roots. In Ireland, the Norse founded long forts, trade stations that became cities. Dublin, the jewel among them, was once a Viking slave market. Today, it's a capital city. In England, Norse place names dot the map like ancient fingerprints. The Danelaw reshaped legal boundaries and local dialects. Words like law, knife, sky, they, and husband are Norse in origin. In Normandy, the Norse didn't just become French, they changed France itself. Their descendants, including William the Conqueror, would reshape English politics forever in 1066. In Russia, the very word ruse may come from the Norse word roder, rowing, and from that name would come a nation. In Iceland, the sagas preserved a world already vanishing, turning oral tradition into permanent cultural architecture. And in Greenland, the stones of Falsey Church still stand, not in defeat, but in silence that resists time. The Vikings never claimed to build empires, and yet they left cities, borders, languages, nations. They gave shape to Europe's coastline, but also to its imagination. 2. The saga mind, a legacy of storytelling. The Norse didn't write history. They sang it, they chanted it, they carried it like flame in their mouths. It wasn't until the Christianization of Iceland that their stories were captured in ink, transcribed by monks who knew that what they held was not just poetry, but soul fire. From the 12th to 14th centuries, the Icelandic sagas, the great epics of Egil, Njal, Grettir, and the Kings, were written down. These were not mere myths. They were biographies etched in blood, tales of law and vengeance, of fate and freedom. They did not glorify war. They questioned it. They revealed the tension between honor and survival, duty and desire. And unlike the chronicles of other medieval worlds, they gave equal weight to emotion. Grief, rage, silence, a woman's prophecy, a child's sorrow, a chieftain's regret. These sagas became the DNA of modern literature, bleeding into Shakespeare, Tolkien, Borges, and beyond. Their structure, lean, direct, tragic, echoes in every modern novel where man confronts a world that does not care whether he wins. The Vikings did not write philosophy. They lived it, then let others write it down. 3. The architecture of law and governance. Where there were no kings, there was the thing. Not a person, a place, a gathering, a court, a parliament. In Iceland, the Althing, established in 930 CE, is one of the oldest parliamentary systems in the world. In Norway, Gulathing and Frostathing laws formed the basis for regional governance before royal centralization. The Viking sense of law was collective, not top-down. Justice was debated, compensation preferred over execution. Even vengeance had rules. This idea, that law emerges from assembly, from voice, echoes through the democratic institutions of Scandinavia today. But it also shaped the West. English common law, trial by jury, legal codes, all carry the faint fingerprint of Norse procedural thinking. The Vikings may have burned churches, but they built systems. 4. Technology and trade, the pulse of a connected world. The longship was more than a vessel. It was freedom, science, and poetry, woven into oak and iron. Light, symmetrical, shallow-draft ships that could sail rivers and open sea alike. Their construction allowed for incredible mobility, precision raids, and later, long-distance trade. But the Norse were not just warriors. They were engineers, sailors, merchants. They brought silk from Constantinople, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from Greenland, glass beads from Baghdad. Their trade routes connected the Christian West, the Muslim world, the Byzantine Empire, and the steppes of Central Asia. The Viking Age was not a time of chaos. It was a proto-global age, one of exchange, innovation, and contact. Faith, from the hammer to the cross. The Norse did not simply abandon their gods. They carried them in shadows. Thor's hammer became a hidden pendant worn beneath the Christian cross. Odin's wisdom transformed into the monk's quiet scholarship. Yggdrasil, the world tree, echoed in the cross of Christ. Conversion was not erasure, it was synthesis. Even as Scandinavia became Christian, its spiritual depth remained steeped in the mythic, its worldview still cyclical, its silence still sacred, and the Norse became missionaries, bishops, saints. They turned faith into something practical, tied to land, law, and loyalty. 6. Bloodlines and borders, the inheritance of rulers. From Viking chieftains came kings. From kings came dynasties. William the Conqueror reshaped England and France. Canute the Great ruled a North Sea empire. And Harold Hardrada, once a mercenary in Byzantium, ruled Norway and almost conquered England. Even today, the royal families of Europe trace lines back to Norse ancestry. Not because of conquest, but because Vikings learned how to stay. They stopped sailing and started governing. 7. The psychological legacy, the soul of the North. And what of the internal world? The Viking legacy isn't just in monuments or manuscripts. It's in how we think about fate, honor, freedom, and death. The idea that life is short, but story is long. That glory fades, but dignity and hardship endures. That one must act, even when the gods are cruel and the ending already written. This psychological realism, this willingness to face the cold, still shapes modern Nordic identity, and beyond. It touches every human who refuses despair, every wanderer, every exile, every person who builds something at the edge of survival. The Norse spirit endures not in flags, but in the willingness to meet life head-on, to live and die awake. Epilogue. What the fire left behind. The Viking Age did not leave behind an empire. It left behind a challenge. To live without guarantee. To build without permanence. To love fiercely, even in a brutal world. They were not immortal, but they made immortality possible through the things they left behind. Iron, ink, ideas, names. And in those fragments, we find not just the past, we find ourselves. But legacy does not live in memory alone. It breathes in the body, in the names passed down, in the blood that outlived the battle. For the ink told their stories, but the blood carried them forward. The axe had been sheathed, the longships moored, the sagas inked, not sung. And yet, the Viking world had not vanished. It had simply transformed, from tempest to current, from lightning to root. And its greatest legacy was not in the weapons left behind, but in the bloodlines that moved forward. For all their voyages and violence, the Norse never built a Rome, no central empire, no monolithic government. But what they did create, slowly, stubbornly, across centuries, was something more resilient. They embedded themselves into the very genetics of Europe, not as foreigners, but as founders. The seed of kings. The story begins with exile, as it so often does. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Norse warriors pushed into England, Ireland, Francia, and the Slavic East. They came as raiders. They stayed as rulers. By the 11th century, Viking warlords weren't sacking thrones. They were marrying into them. The greatest example, Rollo, a Norse chieftain who was granted lands in northern France by Charles the Simple in 911. That land became Normandy. His descendants became Normans, and one of them, William the Conqueror, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, would sail across the English Channel in 1066 and claim the throne of England. The English crown, from that moment on, bore Norse blood. William's descendants, Plantagenets, Lancasters, Tudors, would rule for centuries, and their blood would flow into France, Scotland, Spain, the Netherlands. Even today, Europe's royal lines trace tendrils back to Viking ancestry. The invaders didn't just survive history, they inherited it. 2. The Quiet Kingdoms. In Scandinavia, the transformation was even deeper. After centuries of internal warfare, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerged not just as geographical entities, but as kingdoms. What had once been tribal confederations and coastal fiefdoms became centralized monarchies, each claiming divine right, Christian legitimacy, and Norse lineage. In Norway, The heirs of Harold Fairhair and Saint Olaf built a kingdom tethered to both sword and cross. In Denmark, the legacy of Knut the Great, though his empire crumbled, planted the idea of Danish greatness that would fuel centuries of maritime ambition. In Sweden, slow to centralize, regional jarls gradually submitted to royal authority, blending Old Norse valor with the institutional power of a state. These were not Viking kingdoms anymore. They were European. And yet, they carried within them a spiritual memory of the sea. The kings of Scandinavia became navigators of modernity, their ships now bearing grain, silver, and law instead of flame. And across the North Sea, their cousins still sat on thrones. 3. The Eastern Crown. In the East, the Norse became something even stranger. They became Russians. The Rurikid dynasty, founded by the Varangian chieftain Rurik in Novgorod, evolved into the ruling house of Kiev and Rus. From Rurik's blood came princes of Kiev, and from Kiev, centuries later, came Moscow. Though the Varangian language vanished, their name did not. Rus, it is argued, came from the Norse word roder, rowing. It became the root for Russia. The Viking blood became Slavic law, the axe became the crown, and one day, the descendants of those river warriors would declare themselves Tsars, the Caesars of the East. The Vikings didn't just shape kingdoms, they became them. 4. The cultural fusion. But it wasn't just royal lines that carried Norse legacy. It was the people, the farmers, the artisans, the merchants, the clergy. In regions like Normandy, the Danelaw, Yorkshire, and Orkney, Norse culture fused with local tradition. The result was hybrid societies. Norse-French in language and law. Norse-Anglo in architecture and agriculture. Norse-Gaelic in music, mythology, and kinship. Names like Eric, Knut, and Olaf became part of parish records. Local dialects bore Old Norse grammar. Folk songs retained sea rhythms. Feast days merged pagan festivals with Christian saints. The Viking Age did not die. It melted into the soil of Europe. The Norse gods faded, but Norse culture remained, ghost-like, resilient, tucked into kitchens, names, lullabies, and law codes. The myth of the savage. Centuries later, as Europe sought to define its medieval past, the Viking became mythologized. First as barbarian, a savage invader with horned helmet and no conscience. Then, as noble savage, a pagan rebel free from feudal chains, noble in his wildness. And finally, as ancestor, claimed by nations seeking strength, courage, or origin myths. In each phase, the truth was buried deeper, that the Viking was never a single thing. Not always a killer, not always a king. He was also a farmer, a mother, a lawman, a merchant, a child. The Viking legacy is not defined by how they died, or even how they ruled, but by how they integrated, how they adapted, married, wrote, governed, planted. Their blood-shaped nations not because it was spilled, but because it remained. 6. The modern throne. Even today, Viking blood sits in royal veins. The current monarchs of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden trace lineage to medieval Norse kings. The British monarchy descends through the Normans from Rollo, the Viking chieftain. In Iceland, the president's office stands just miles from where Viking assemblies were once held. The blood that once cried for the storm now signs trade deals, attends ceremonies, opens Olympic Games. The rage is gone, but the resilience remains. These rulers are not warlords, but they carry, buried deep beneath diplomacy and protocol, the quiet knowledge that their nations were once carved not with ink, but with iron. 7. The blood beneath our feet. Today, when we speak of Viking legacy, we often look up, at castles, flags, crowns. But perhaps we should also look down, into the DNA of the land, into the quiet towns with Norse street names, into the language of common law, into the songs that still bear three-beat rhythms from rowers on the fjord, and into our own blood. Because the true legacy of the Vikings is not just in whose names were written in books, it is in the millions whose names were never recorded, whose lives, struggles, stories, and bloodlines were folded into the fabric of nations. The blacksmith in York, the baker in Dublin, the shepherd in Normandy, the widow in Iceland, the orphan in Kiev. They are gone, but they left us something unshakable: structure, resilience, a memory of the wind. Epilogue. What blood remembers. 1,000 years have passed since the last Viking longship made landfall in war, and yet their story never ended. Because blood remembers, not just in crowns or empires, but in gestures, in instincts, in the strange comfort we feel near the sea, in the courage to leave, in the wisdom to stay, in the capacity to rebuild after fire. What the Norse gave us was not supremacy. It was a pulse, to challenge, to adapt, to persist. And in that sense, they did not vanish. They became us. For in the blood they left behind flowed more than memory. It carried the seed of thrones. And as the centuries turned, the hands once gripped to oars and axes would reach for crowns. When we first met them, they came as fire. Storms with beards, oars pounding like thunder. The sea was their kingdom, and ash was their signature. They raided monasteries, they shattered kingdoms, they stole, slaughtered, vanished. And yet, by the end of the 11th century, these same men, or their sons, wore crowns. The Vikings, the feared scourge of Christendom, had become the rulers of Christian kingdoms. They were no longer wolves at the gate. They sat on thrones behind them. This is the story of how raiders became kings, of how the edge became the center, and how chaos carved the path to order. I, the first crown, from outlaw to unifier. In Norway, it began with one man's hair and one woman's vow. Harold Fairhair, legend says, refused to cut his hair until he had unified all of Norway under one rule. And so he fought, clan by clan, coast by coast. By the late 9th century, he had subdued the Jarls and declared himself king. The first in a land where rule had previously come from blood feuds, not borders. But Harold's unity came at a cost. Many chieftains, unwilling to bend the knee, fled westward, fueling Viking migrations to Iceland, Orkney, Ireland, and Greenland. So even as the seed of monarchy took root in Norway, it sent out waves of rebellion. The Viking spirit would not vanish, but it was being domesticated. 2. Denmark rises, the crown by sea. In Denmark, power followed water. While Norway struggled with mountainous terrain and scattered settlements, Denmark was compact, fertile, and central. It became a powerhouse not through land war, but through maritime dominance. The Danish kings were the first to realize that if longships could raid, they could also rule. By the time of King Gorm the Old, or 936 to 958, Denmark had begun to crystallize as a kingdom. His son, Harald Bluetooth, pushed the transformation further. Harald converted to Christianity, partly by choice, partly by pressure, and proclaimed, "I have made the Danes Christian." He also left behind the gelling stones, massive rune-carved monoliths, declaring Denmark's unification and conversion, not by sword alone, but by symbol. Harald understood that kingship was not just about bloodshed, it was about story. 3. Knut the Great, empire from the sea. Then came the greatest Norse king of all, Knut the Great, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, grandson of Harald Bluetooth. Knut did not just rule Denmark, he conquered England. and later Norway. From 1016 to 1035, he commanded a North Sea empire. 3 kingdoms, hundreds of ports, 1 king. And he did so not with endless war, but with governance. He kept the Anglo-Saxon legal system intact. He respected the church. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of the former English king, to legitimize his claim. He issued law codes in Latin. He traveled with priests. He paid tithes to Rome. The sea wolf had become a Roman lion. One legend tells of Knut commanding the tide to halt, to prove to his flattering courtiers that no king, no matter how great, could defy nature. Whether true or not, the story holds a deeper truth. The Viking Age of defiance was ending, and in its place rose order, humility, crown. 4. Sweden's quiet kings. In Sweden, the road to monarchy was longer, its terrain more forested, its power more tribal. But even there, kingship took root. Olof Skotkonung, in the late 10th century, was the first Swedish king to be baptized a Christian. He minted coins bearing his name, just like the rulers of England and Germany. Sweden, too, became part of Christendom. Its kings would soon found cities like Sigtuna, promote church law, and eventually integrate into continental European politics. While Norway roared and Denmark conquered, Sweden endured. Its monarchy was quiet. But it lasted. The Norman kings. Meanwhile, in Normandy, the descendants of Rollo had grown into something even stranger. French-speaking Vikings, dukes by title, but kings in ambition. And in 1066, one of them, William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, sailed to England. There, at the Battle of Hastings, he defeated Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king. He became William the Conqueror. And England became forever changed. French became the language of court. Norman castles dotted the landscape. Feudalism took root. But beneath the silk and ceremony, William was still Viking. He demanded loyalty. He rode into battle with fury. He rewarded his men with land, not just gold. And from his line came the Plantagenets, who ruled England for centuries. The blood of Ragnar and Rollo now wore ermine robes. 6. The Eastern Crowns, Rurik's ghost. In the east, the Varangians had also climbed the ladder of kingship. The dynasty of Rurik, a Norse chieftain who took Novgorod in 862, had grown powerful in Kiev. His descendants, including Oleg, Igor, and Yaroslav the Wise, ruled over a vast and multi-ethnic state. They adopted Slavic culture, built churches, made treaties with Byzantium, but they remembered their northern roots. The Varangian Guard, elite Norse warriors, served as bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor himself. Even in Constantinople, the Viking shadow loomed. These rulers did not wear winged helmets. They wore crowns, but their hands still bore the calluses of oars. 7. The nature of Norse kingship. What made these kings different? They came from a world where leadership was earned, not inherited. Where the thing, the assembly, could judge a chieftain as harshly as any enemy. They brought this ethos into kingship. Early Norse kings had to convince, not just command. Their legitimacy came from consensus. Marriages, alliances, councils, not just divine right. This legacy endures. Even today, Scandinavian monarchies remain constitutional, accessible, non-absolutist. The Viking king was never a god. He was a man, judged by strength, wisdom, and his ability to provide. V8. The final crowns. By the 12th century, the transformation was complete. The last Norse kings who spoke of Odin had long been buried. The sagas were being transcribed by Christian monks. The longship had become a merchant vessel. But in Iceland, in Norway, in Denmark, in Sweden, the blood still ruled. And far from being erased, the Viking world had become the foundation of modern monarchy in the north. Even in Britain, Normandy, and Russia, the echo remained. Not just raiders, not just traders, not just warriors, but kings. Epilogue: the crown on the waves. To look at a Viking king is to see contradiction, a seafarer in a throne room, a farmer commanding armies, a pagan baptized. And yet there is no contradiction, only evolution. The same instincts that guided men to sail into storms, to risk it all for a future not yet seen, also built kingdoms. Leadership was not an accident. It was an inheritance carved from frost and fire. And so when you see the coronation of a Scandinavian monarch today, when you hear the anthem, "Watch the golden crown lifted," know that the ceremony is ancient, not in the robes, but in the blood. The Vikings did not vanish. They ascended. The crown was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of something quieter, not forged in flame, but tempered in time. Because the Vikings did not stop when they sat on thrones. They transformed. The long ships no longer crossed the sea. The gods no longer ruled the sky. The runes no longer carved fate into stone, and yet, the Vikings were never truly gone. They did not vanish into the mists of time. They became time, not erased, transformed. This is not the story of a people who disappeared. It is the story of a people who evolved, from sea raiders to statesmen, from warriors to farmers, from poets of the axe to architects of law. And though the Viking Age officially ended by the 12th century, what followed was not an absence. It was a transmutation. A culture. Molten, then forged. Anew. Transformation is never loud. It does not shout like conquest or sing like saga. It is quiet. It happens in kitchens, in churches, in the way a name is whispered to a child. In the centuries after the last Viking king was crowned, the Norse spirit flowed underground, into custom, language, rhythm. Old gods became folk stories. Myths became metaphors. The longhouse became the stone hearth of rural Scandinavia. But you could still hear the old voice, in lullabies, in law codes, in the silence between storms. The Norse didn't vanish. They simply took off their helmets and lived. 2. Christianity was not conquest. It was alchemy. Much is made of the Norse conversion to Christianity. And yes, there were missionaries, there were kings baptized, there were old temples burned or buried. But the truth is more nuanced. The Norse did not abandon their beliefs. They folded them into the new faith. Thor's hammer became a cross, worn beneath the shirt. Odin's wisdom became the monk's contemplation. The world tree, Yggdrasil, echoed in the Christian cross. Even the Viking understanding of fate, weird, the woven threads of destiny, echoed in Christian ideas of divine providence. This wasn't surrender. It was syncretism. The Norse had always been adaptive. They took what worked, what endured, and remade it in their own image. So when they built cathedrals, they didn't forget how to read the wind. Their god changed. Their spirit did not. 3. The sagas didn't die. They became literature. While Europe wrote in Latin and cloistered its stories in cathedrals, the Icelanders did something radical. They wrote their own history, in their own language. From the 12th to 14th centuries, the Norse oral tradition was committed to ink, not as myth, as memory. The Icelandic sagas, written by descendants of Viking settlers, were not fanciful tales. They were narratives of blood and bone, domestic dramas, revenge feuds, family collapses, legal disputes. And in writing them, the Norse people declared something bold. We mattered. We were not savages. We were human. These sagas became the literary foundation of Northern Europe. They influenced Shakespeare, Melville, Tolkien, Borges. They are still studied today, not just as artifacts, but as art. In transforming their spoken word into written legacy, the Vikings ensured that even if their temples rotted, their stories would never die. 4. The sword became the law. What began with raiding ended with order. The Viking Age had long operated on personal loyalty, vengeance, honor. But in the centuries that followed, that same energy was redirected. Norse societies, especially in Iceland and Norway, codified their customs into lawbooks. They created legal frameworks rooted in community discussion, justice by compensation, and oral deliberation. This legacy survives. Modern Scandinavian legal systems are among the fairest and most transparent in the world. Their roots? In the Thing, the Viking assembly, where even kings had to listen. The sword was laid down, and in its place, a social contract was written. Seafaring became commerce. Once, the Norse traveled the seas for conquest, but now they sailed for connection. As the Viking Age ended, Scandinavians didn't stop building ships. They just changed what those ships carried. Fish, timber, furs, grain, amber. The same technology that made them raiders now made them traders. Ports that once feared the Norse now welcomed them as merchants. And this wasn't a betrayal of their heritage. It was its natural evolution. They had mastered the sea. Now they mastered the market. The Vikings were never just about destruction. They were about adaptability. 6. Kingship reimagined. By the 13th century, the Viking concept of leadership had evolved. The old war chiefs and sea lords had given way to kings who ruled by law, not just might. Monarchs now built schools, sponsored poets, funded cathedrals, standardized coinage. Yet even in this, echoes of the Viking world remained. The emphasis on consensus, the respect for assemblies, the humility before nature. Even today, Scandinavian monarchies are deeply constitutional, ceremonial, and culturally integrated. They are descendants not just of Rollo and Knut, but of the Thing, the legal assembly that ruled with words, not swords. The Viking king did not die. He grew wiser. 7. The North remembered across Europe, the Viking image morphed, first as villain, then as hero, then as ancestor. But in the North, people never forgot the truth. In Norway, sagas were read like scripture. In Iceland, genealogy traced back to the settlers of the 9th century. In Sweden and Denmark, museums filled with ship models, weapons, tools, not to glorify violence, but to remember resilience. In Greenland, even long after the Norse had vanished, their ruins were still spoken of with reverence. The transformation didn't erase the Viking. It preserved him in different forms. A farmer in a wool tunic, a bishop writing in runes, a child learning Norse mythology alongside Christian parables. The past didn't die. It became part of the soil. 8. The inheritance. We still carry. What remains of the Vikings today? More than you think. In words, sky, egg, knife, window, husband, law. In days of the week, Thursday, Thor's Day, Wednesday, Odin's Day, Friday, Frigg's Day. In values, equality, independence, exploration, craftsmanship, resilience. In a world shaped by conquest, the Vikings remind us of something else. That identity is not lost when it changes. It is strengthened. The Norse were not undone by time. They partnered with it. They melted into modernity without losing their shape. You can still feel them in the wind of the fjords, in the names of northern towns, in the logic of northern law. They're in our bones, in our language, in our stories, not as relics, as roots. Epilogue. What was transformed still speaks. Transformation is not failure, it is alchemy. The Vikings did not fall. They rose into something larger. They became kings, farmers, poets, judges. They traded axes for plows, sails for scriptures, vengeance for law. But they never forgot who they were. And neither did we. When you speak truth boldly, when you face storms without fear, when you build something lasting from nothing, you are not just surviving. You are carrying forward the old fire in a new form. And in that moment, you are Viking. They did not vanish. They became seed and stone, memory and movement. And though the axe gave way to law and the saga became scripture, the earth itself remembered. Long after the sails vanished from the horizon, long after the last runestone was carved, the world still carries the echo of the Norse. Not just in bloodlines, not just in books, but in stones, in seashells, in the wind that moves across an old fjord or the ruins of a forgotten farm. This is not nostalgia. This is presence. The Vikings are not gone. They are around you. In every storm-weathered chapel, in every syllable of the word sky, in every law that protects the dignity of a citizen. Their story did not stay in the north. It migrated. It settled. It became part of the earth itself. The stone that speaks in silence. In Scandinavia, the ground still whispers in runes. Thousands of runestones, often unnoticed by tourists and forgotten by time, still stand in fields and near farmhouses. They were not just gravestones. They were declarations, memorials, warnings, written in straight, angular runes, the language of permanence. Bjorn raised this stone in memory of Asmund, his brother. Gunvor carved these runes for her husband, who sailed to the east and never returned. Ingigerd built this bridge for her father. May God help his soul. These stones were not loud, but they were meant to endure. Today they are not just artifacts. They are conversations with the dead. Each stone is a moment, frozen in time, still standing where it was placed 1,000 winters ago. Even in silence, they speak. 2. The sea that carries their name. Across the North Sea, Baltic, and North Atlantic, Viking place names still linger. Normandy, named for the Northmen. Dublin, once Dyflin, a Viking port built on a black pool. York, once Jorvik, a Norse kingdom with its own mint and market square. Limerick, Waterford, and Wexford founded not by Irish kings, but Norse merchants and warlords. In England, over 1,500 towns and villages still bear Norse linguistic DNA. The suffix by, meaning farmstead or village, in names like Grimsby or Derby. The suffix thorp, a secondary settlement, as in Scunthorpe. The word thingwall, denoting an assembly field, a place where early Norse law was spoken aloud and heard by free men. Even the English language itself, blending Old English with Old Norse, bears the fingerprint of cohabitation. Words like window, knife, sky, anger, and husband all came from the Norse tongue. They crossed the sea not in books, but in mouths. And they stayed. 3. Iceland. The memory preserved in fire and ice. Nowhere did the Norse soul preserve itself more fully than in Iceland. Settled in the late 9th century by exiled Norwegian chieftains, Iceland became something remarkable. A society built by those who chose freedom over kingship. No central monarchy, no temples to tyrants, just farms, assemblies, and the Althing, the world's oldest parliamentary institution, founded in 930. Iceland preserved its Norse traditions because it remained geographically isolated and politically defiant. Its oral history became the sagas. Its farms became living museums. Its lava fields held not just volcanoes, but ancestral gravity. Even today, Icelanders can trace their lineage back to Viking settlers with genealogical precision. They walk streets where stories were born. They speak a language older than most modern nations. They remember because they never had to forget. 4. Greenland and the Arctic silence. To the west lies Greenland, once home to the most remote Norse communities in the world. Today, only ruins remain. Churches without roofs, farmsteads swallowed by moss, a bishop's throne surrounded by wind and sea. But these ruins matter, because they are the footprints at the edge of the world. Proof that the Norse dared not only to raid, but to settle where no other dared, to carve civilization from frozen ground, to bring cattle and Christianity to a land without trees. Their failure was not shame. It was proof of courage. They lived, barely, bravely, on the cliff between survival and myth. V. The Varangian East. Memory along the rivers. In the East, Norse legacy took a different path. Along the rivers of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, the Norse did not leave behind runestones. They left behind dynasties. The Rurikid rulers of Kiev on Ruses may no longer exist, but their stories remain. Their warriors, Varangians, are still depicted in Byzantine art. Blonde giants with axes, standing guard over emperors. And the Slavic word Rus itself, many argue, may derive from the Norse word roder, or rowing crew. Even today, the idea of a strong central ruler in Eastern Slavic lands traces back to the Varangian model, the war leader who unites, defends, and judges. The Norse may have vanished from these lands in body, but they remain in form. 6. In wood, in metal, in hands. Viking heritage does not live only in stone and story. It lives in craft. From the intricate knotwork of Norse jewelry to the dragon-headed prows of longships, their sense of beauty was always paired with purpose. Today, Scandinavian design, minimalist, functional, organic, still echoes Viking sensibilities. The emphasis on form and function, on simplicity with depth, on craftsmanship that honors both nature and utility. Even in modern tools, boats, and furniture, you can sometimes feel the ancient hand shaping the new. 7. In ceremony and song. In parts of Scandinavia, old songs still hum with Norse rhythm. Folk dances echo the stomp of warriors. Wedding rituals preserve ancestral gestures. Feasts in Iceland or Norway may still open with toasts to ancestors, much like the old blots, sacrifices that honored gods and spirits. And every year in dozens of towns across Europe, from Shetland's Up-Helligdagsfjord festival to Denmark's Viking markets, men and women dress as their ancestors, not to glorify war, but to remember fire and to pass it on. 8. In the way we walk the world. The deepest legacy of the Norse is not physical. It is behavioral. It is how people in the North think, build, speak, and govern. A preference for consensus over coercion. A cultural value on humility, effort, and survival. An identity shaped by weather, not wealth. Even the famed Scandinavian social model, egalitarian, cooperative, community-focused, has roots in the Viking past, when equality at the thing was expected and leadership was earned, not inherited. We speak often of Viking bravery, but their real gift was balance. Between freedom and structure, between strength and community, and between exploration and domesticity, and in that balance they created nations that still thrive. Epilogue. The stones are still warm. We once thought the Vikings were a moment, a brief eruption of violence and flame, but we were wrong. They were a movement, a shifting of the earth, and their echo is still present, not only in history, but in you. When you value resilience, you honor them. When you raise your voice at a council table, you echo the thing. When you take risks with your hands and build something that lasts, you walk where they walked, not in ships, but in spirit. They are across the sea, in every stone. And in those stones, still warm from the fire of their story, we begin to see what we missed all along. They were never just shadows from the sea. They were something far greater. They called them raiders, barbarians, heathens, shadows from the sea. And yes, there was truth in the blood. The monasteries did burn. The gold did vanish into ships shaped like dragons. The fear was real, and it lasted for generations. But to leave the story there is to murder its meaning, because the Vikings were never just a terror in the night. They were not born only to destroy. They were builders, dreamers, mothers, fathers, poets, lawmakers, sailors, smiths, and kings. They were not just raiders. They were a civilization in motion. The fire, was the beginning. Yes, they came with fire. The first chapter of their saga was written in flame. On the shores of Lindisfarne in 793, in the halls of Charlemagne's empire, across the rivers of the Slavs, into the monasteries, cities, and sanctuaries of Europe. But look closely. That fire was not only destruction, it was a signal, a question, a challenge to the old world. Who said the future belongs only to the crowned? The Norse came to test the myth of order. They shattered the illusion of safety, and in doing so, they redefined power. Because behind every raid was a response to hunger, to land scarcity, to fragmented leadership, to a yearning for more than what fjords alone could give. They came not only for silver, they came because the world had grown too small for their ambition. 2. The sea was their teacher. No civilization ever understood the sea the way the Vikings did. They studied the wind like scripture. They read the stars without needing ink. They carved the deep with ships that had no equal in their time. To the Norse, the sea was not a boundary. It was a pathway, a map to places unseen, a rhythm for the soul. They moved from Norway to Iceland, from Denmark to England, from Sweden to Kiev, from Greenland to Vinland, and they did it not as lost men wandering, but as navigators with intent. They built ports before cities, markets before temples, communities before cathedrals. Their oars shaped not just tides, but the trade routes of continents: the Baltic, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, the Mississippi of their age. Their compass was instinct. Their maps were memory. Their ambition was limitless. 3. They saw the world, and the world saw them. The Vikings did not raid a world that was passive. They entered a world in flux and helped shape its rebirth. They met monks and merchants, emperors and exiles. They negotiated with Abbasids, served Byzantines, challenged Carolingians. And they didn't just take. They traded. They married. They settled. They absorbed ideas, languages, gods, and laws, and gave back sagas, ships, art, and governance. From Normandy to Novgorod, from York to Reykjavik, their touch was not temporary. It became infrastructure. Their houses became cathedrals, their markets became cities, their legends became literature, their assemblies became parliaments, and their children, they became us. 4. The sword gave way to the quill. They knew how to fight, yes, but they also knew how to remember. Icelandic farmers wrote down epics in the dark. Old women passed down stories in firelight. Runes were carved into bone, iron, and granite. Even when the axe fell silent, the voice endured. From Njal's saga to Heimskringla, from the Prose Edda to the Vinland sagas, the Norse gave us one of the most extraordinary literary legacies in world history, not despite their violence, but because they understood that life without memory is death in disguise. And they remembered everything: the storms, the betrayals, the lovers, the laws, the land. They remembered, and they wrote it down, not to glorify but to warn, not to weep but to teach. They left not a scripture but a mirror. The crown wasn't the end. It was the evolution. They did not stay raiders forever. They became kings. Knut of Denmark ruled England. Rollo of Normandy became a duke, then a dynasty. Harald Hardrada became legend. The Rurikids ruled Kiev and Rus. The Normans reshaped Britain, Sicily, and Jerusalem. But even in the crown, the Norse soul remained. These were not kings of pampered blood. They were kings who had once rode, fought, built, lost. Their kingdoms were not imposed. They were forged. And when they ruled, they brought something the old world had forgotten: a respect for courage, a hatred of tyranny, a belief that leadership is earned, not inherited. They taught Europe that kings could come from nowhere, that greatness could rise from the sea. 6. The myth of vanishing history. Books often close the Viking chapter around 1066. But that's a trick of perspective. The raids stopped, but the story didn't. The Norse spirit bled into governments, into villages, into the very words we use. It was not erased. It was diluted into the bloodstream of civilization. Their shipbuilding shaped the naval empires that followed. Their legal systems informed Scandinavian democracy. Their language molded English itself. Their iconography re-emerged in modern nationalism, myth, and art. They did not disappear. They became the scaffolding. And like all true builders, they left not their names on the front door, but their fingerprints on the frame. 7. What they gave us. They gave us more than we often admit. The courage to leave home. The instinct to shape law from voice. The value of equality in the thing. The rhythm of community over kingship. The belief that story matters even in the cold. The idea that every man and woman, regardless of birth, can change the world. And in a time like ours, drifting, noisy, rootless, perhaps we need the Norse now more than ever, not for their war, but for their discipline, their memory, their insistence on living wide and deep, even when the world narrowed to ice. Final words: the flame beneath the ice. They were not just raiders. They were our ancestors. And like all ancestors, they lived in contradiction. Noble and brutal. Faithful and skeptical. Communal and independent. Wild and wise. But they lived. Fully. Fiercely, without apology. They sang in the storm. They dared across the void. They made homes in exile. They stitched kingdoms from chaos. And when they were done, they handed the world back to us. Changed. If you ever feel small, if you ever wonder if you belong, if you ever feel like the world was not made for people like you, remember this. Neither was it made for them. So they made it anyway. They built a world out of wood, bone, and sea spray. And now, we live in its shadow. We breathe their air. We carry their names. They were not just raiders. They were legacy. They came from lands carved by wind and water, from mountains that spoke only in silence, from fjords that hid more secrets than they told. The Norse were born not of ease, but of edge of survival, edge of the map, edge of what humanity thought it could be. And though their sails were once feared and their blades once red, what they truly left behind was not ruin. It was rhythm. A rhythm that still pulses in the DNA of Northern law, in the weight of a Scandinavian silence, in the stubborn dignity of rural Iceland, in every rune chiseled into forgotten granite, in every soul who chooses to walk into the unknown rather than kneel in safety. They were not an empire. They did not build walls to enclose. They built ships to reach, to learn, to become. In 793, the West first recorded their coming with terror. But the true legacy of the Vikings was never conquest. It was transformation. They turned hardship into art, exile into civilization, chaos into custom, memory into myth. They turned the raw material of survival into a blueprint for endurance. This is what we learned across the 15 parts of their saga. That fire is not always destruction. Sometimes it's illumination. That exile is not always punishment. Sometimes it's prophecy. That a people can vanish from history books yet remain in stone, law, language, and spirit. That kings can rise from nowhere and bring order to everywhere. That legacy isn't what you conquer. It's what you leave behind when you stop trying to be remembered. From Lindisfarne to Vinland, from Novgorod to Normandy, from the icy silence of Greenland to the scribes of Iceland, they traced their presence not across one empire, but across the edges of every world. Their story did not end. It dissolved, like mist, like a song no longer sung, but remembered. It seeped into other languages, other institutions, other identities. It became subtext. And that is perhaps the most Viking thing of all, to leave without leaving, to disappear, and still define what follows. If you walk the shores of Norway, you can still hear it. Not in words, but in the wind. A voice older than stone, younger than time. It doesn't ask to be heard, but if you're quiet long enough, it will say, "We were not just raiders, we were your beginning." And so we end, not with a monument, but with a question. What will you leave behind? Because legacy is not just for kings and conquerors. It's for those who endure, who remember, who build something in the cold, even when no one is watching. Just like they did. Just like the wind still does. Still. Speaking. Norse.